Excellencies. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm, as you heard, Major General Mike Ward. I had a few words last night. I only got about 5 minutes, well, maybe 15 minutes into my speech. I'd like to carry on and get to the rest of that this morning. No, I'm just kidding. We've got four very esteemed panelists who are going to help us understand the magnitude of the Kosovo issue from the perspectives of diplomacy, policy, military, and a variety of different vectors. This is going to be the icebreaker, I think, for the day's symposium. And I think about icebreaking, and I think about that first winter in Kosovo in 1999. And we had many troops who were stationed up on Mount Golesh. And if you're from Kosovo, you could see it in the distance. And it's lovely because it's always white at the top as you get to the fall and into the winter. There was a lot of icebreaking that we did up on Mount Golesh in order to be able to do our job. This is really the scene setter. And we've got four, as I said, esteemed panelists, starting with Dr. Bob Bergen, who's with us from the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies, the University of Calgary. We have Dr. Valerie Percival, who's with us from the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Ambassador retired Wendy Gilmour, former public servant and also from Foreign Affairs and from DND, who was really the firefighter of foreign affairs in Kosovo during those initial years, and Dr. Gerry Van Kessel, who was an official with Citizenship and Immigration during those fateful days. Each panelist is going to present for about 10 to 12 minutes, and that will leave us about half an hour for Q&A. Having heard everything you heard last night and what you're going to be treated to this morning, that should really get your intellectual juices flowing for a dynamic Q&A session. And we look forward to that. What I'd like to do is invite our panelists up to sit here. And then what I will do is I'll stage manage them through their presentations and provide you just a little bit more information and background about what they bring to our deliberations today.
Order you want us in, Mike?
How about, no, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Where you are is fine.
You can be bookend.
So I'll just specify at the beginning, the order of march for this will be Dr. Bergen, followed by Dr. Percival, then Ambassador Gilmour, and bringing up, batting fourth in the lineup will be Dr. Van Kessel. First and foremost, as you may have seen in your program, Dr. Bergen has a very, very long and storied career as a journalist and as a professor teaching journalism. He was involved in from the journalistic side of the Kosovo air campaign and is going to share with us this morning some of those aspects that he encountered and which can give us some good thoughts about how we actually deal between officials and the press during some of those dynamic situations we find ourselves in. I would just want to continue with one thought that I was trying to share with you last night, and that was about the security situation that we found in Kosovo from June 1999 leading up to May of 2000. And as I mentioned at that point in time, it was very fluid, it was dynamic, and it was fraught with risk and often critical risk for individuals in the communities. We worked very hard with the boots on the ground that we had to cover the hot spots that were there, but there were never enough boots on the ground to make a complete difference and to create peace and security right off the bat. And that was something that only evolved day by day. Now, our troops were only there for that first year, and there was a huge NATO reshuffle of military forces between Kosovo and Bosnia, and we went back to Bosnia in those large numbers in 2000. But day by day, that security situation evolved. It didn't seem to evolve quickly enough for us on the ground. And a year is a long time for a soldier who is trying to do his or her job day by day to help move things along. But it's a long time for a soldier. It's not a long time in that progression that we're trying to get to bring things back to normality and allow this thriving country of Kosovo to become instantiated. But 25 years later, you do have that opportunity. to see how much each of those very, very minuscule steps contribute to the end state that we're seeing so far. Okay. So I think that's the great takeaway of being able to come back to a situation 25 years later and understand how much the contributions of all of those people have brought to the situation and enabled in terms of a new nation, a new democracy, as His Excellency says, standing up and becoming a partner in the community of nations. Without further ado, let me invite Dr. Bob Bergen to the stage. As I said, Bob was a journalist, an award-winning journalist, an author, and is going to share with us some of his thoughts on the nature of the operations in Kosovo. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bergen to the stage.
Well, good morning, and I really am honored to be part of this, and what an incredible evening that was last night. I can tell you, I met people who I talked to before, interviewed, exchanged emails with for years, but had never actually met them, and among them was Billy Flynn and Mike Parker, the two medal-winning fighter pilots. I didn't write about the humanitarian mission much. I'm from the Center for Military and Strategic Studies. What I wrote about was the war. And I asked the organizers, so I wrote this book, Scattering Chaff, which is about the war. What do you want me to talk about? And she said, how about the book? So that's really where this starts. And what it took to bring it about is a long story, let me tell you. Results were pretty astonishing when I saw it published, and to have it win an award was beyond anything that I could ever dream of. So between March 24 and 10 June 1999, Canadian Air Force pilots from Canadian Forces Bagotville, Quebec, and Cold Lake, Alberta, flying CF-18s, dropped nearly 500,000 pounds of high explosive munitions on Serbian military targets in Kosovo. Of them, 171 were Mark 82 500-pound gravity or dumb bombs, 262 were GBU-12 500-pound precision-guided bombs, and 128 were GBU-12 2,000-pound precision-guided bombs. It was during a bid by a coalition of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries to halt ethnic cleansing of minority Albanians in the former Yugoslavian Republic of the Serbian military of Slobodan Milosevic in the late 1990s. The Canadian commitment of 18 CF-18s represented a little less than 2% of nearly 1,000 NATO aircraft involved in Operation Allied Force, as the effort was called. Nonetheless, as you heard Billy Flynn say last night, the Canadians flew 10% of the most dangerous bombing missions. And I know, I wrote that off and on for almost 17 years. My research into it began as a doctoral thesis at the University of Calgary, completed in 2005, and continued over the next 14 years, 14, as I endeavored to have it published as a book by any one of a number of Canadian commercial publishers or university presses. You know, when I read that Prince Harry received a $20 million advance on his book, I could only weep with happiness for him. It finally came about in 2019 through the University of Calgary Press in the form of Scattering Chaff, Canadian Air Power and the Censorship during the Kosovo War. Scattering Chaff has a dual focus. The first was to learn and write about the men and women of the Canadian Air Force who fought the war based in Aviano, Italy, at the behest of the Canadian government's contribution to Operation Echo. To do that, I'm forever indebted to the men and women of the Canadian Air Force based in Cold Lake, Bagotville, and elsewhere across Canada who agreed to my many, many requests to interview them, from the corporals to the generals. A number of them were here at this conference and still are. I'm particularly indebted to Colonels Bill Cleland and Andre Vienne, commanders of 4-Wing Cold Lake and 3-Wing Bagotville, who permitted me to talk to their men and women. It was after the fact, but they wanted Canadians to know what their pilots and ground crew did during the Kosovo War. I also used the Access to Information Act to unearth original government and Air Force documents that proved what I learned over the years to be true. I learned how incredibly unprepared the Air Force was when the Canadian government threw it into the conflict with a litany of shortcomings in the aircraft's equipment and pilot training. Through no fault of the Air Force's own, and thanks to the government's relentless assault on military funding in the 1990s, ostensibly to reduce the budget deficits. I learned that the 500-pound bombs they were originally supplied with domestically were insufficient to take the paint off the rails of the bridges they were bombing. That put them at an unnecessary risk, and they were often assigned to the same targets a second time. I learned that they had to borrow equipment from the United States Air Force to transport roughly $9 million worth of American bombs back to the Canadian hangars for the missions after they ran out into a week into the campaign. Giving new meaning to the well-worn bank company phrase, "Don't leave home without it." Canadian technicians bought those millions of dollars of bombs from their American counterparts with their government-issued credit cards. I learned that target selection process was not left to military planners, but rather was influenced by politicians who thought the bombing campaign would be short-lived, about 2 to 4 days to be exact. As a result, just 3 days targets were selected. To put it bluntly, the bombing efforts for all of NATO were under-resourced, the targeting process was erratic, and the aircraft too few. Further, the Combined Air Operations Center in Vicenza, Italy, had no flexible targeting cell that could authorize an expanded target list. The Canadian government documented the targeting process, but those documents remain exempt from disclosure under the Access to Information Act because their release could damage the conduct of international affairs in the defense of Canada. What I did learn from the pilots was that the targets had to be proved for their military value by Canadian military lawyers in Aviano who vetted them. Lawyers could veto missions based on a target's military worth or proximity to civilians based on the CF-18's flight paths. In addition, each pilot's missions were documented by flight recorders that were turned on as they entered the battle space. The flight recorders recorded up to 3 hours, so everything the pilots did was scrutinized by lawyers upon their return, including where the bombs landed and what they hit. For some pilots, that vetting was a source of frustration, for others a source of comfort, and for more, a source of stress. One pilot told me, "That was something new for us, to actually have a lawyer with us in Aviano looking over the targets. Every country has a list of declared special sites, religious sites, historic significant sites, and they're obligated to not hide their military equipment at any of those sites. We made every effort to spare those sites. The lawyers would be looking over our shoulders to be sure we were in that mind and that we didn't use a bigger bomb than we had to." Another told me, "Some people would complain probably that it was a bit of a pain in the ass having them there, but they really sanitized the targets." I was quite confident I personally wasn't carrying out any atrocities or anything that was questionable. They were quite careful at all levels to ensure that there was no collateral damage, the things you see on TV, such as markets blowing up. Still another said, "The lawyers were there absolutely to keep us safe, but sometimes they tied our hands significantly in the belief that, always looking for the 100% solution, because most of the time we don't deal in 100% solutions because we often don't have the time for 100% solutions." I learned that the pilots were subjected to unimaginable risks on their nighttime bombing missions because even though 441 Squadron had tried to get them for years, the Department of National Defense refused to procure night vision goggles for them. I learned that lack of night vision goggles forced the pilots to focus their radars of their CF-18s in front of them so they wouldn't crash into each other rather than search for threats on the ground at night. I learned that the CF-18's mission computers were the equivalent of Commodore 64 computing dinosaurs that could barely handle the CF-18's Nighthawk laser designating pods acquired in 1977. Commodore computers. The pods enabled targeting identification using 4-power magnification and heat sensing equipment that enabled pilots to home bombs onto their targets by directing laser energy at them. The problem was the Canadian government only bought 13 of them, and there were two were immediately taken out of service and cannibalized for parts, leaving the rest divided between Cold Lake and Bagotville for training. When the first of 12 CF-18s were sent to Avio in the summer of 1988, just 8 pods were sent with them, and 3 were left in Canada to train up the other 2 ranges in Canada. When the department acquired 6 contractor models mid-mission at just $9,000 each, $9,000, to show you how much money is involved compared to 9 million bombs. There were still woefully insufficient in numbers to meet those needs in theater and to train other pilots and back in Canada. Further, as the technology went, the Canadians were using the poor cousin variant. Their 4-power magnification was a fraction of the 8 and 10-power magnification of some American pilots were using, and dinosaurs compared to the United States global positioning systems that enabled target acquisition through cloud cover. If the Canadians uncovered cloud cover, which they often did, they had no choice but to return home with their undelivered bombs. I learned that the CF-18s were equipped with radios the pilots used to communicate with each other that were easily jammed mid-flight by using simple Radio Shack type transmitters. One pilot told me that he distinctly remembered returning to Aviano after a mission, having his radio jammed with Canadian songbirds Celine Dion's music. How did they know it's us up here tonight? He wondered. That no Canadians were shot down and killed was nothing short of miraculous and is a powerful testament to their immeasurable bravery and skill. There is much, much more in the pages of Scattering Chaff, and undoubtedly much, much more resides in the memories of pilots and others who served so courageously in Aviano, who I was unable to interview. Secondly, what Scattered Chaff argues, as I do in this presentation, is that most Canadians know nothing about what the airmen and women did over the skies of Kosovo in 1999. I argue that much of that ignorance need not have been, and is the absolute result of absolute censorship involved by the Canadian, not by the Canadian government, which is the only body enabled to invoke censorship during war. Rather, that censorship was invoked by less than a handful of misguided Air Force commanders in Aviano and Ottawa who wrongly believed that Canadian journalists posed a threat to their operational security. As such, those commanders were solely responsible for inexcusably undermining press freedom and its role in a democracy during the Kosovo War. I argue that their belief in operational security was born of a complete another myth that emerged from the Persian Gulf War news 8 years earlier. They thought if the news media interviewed the Air Force members and told their stories, military families would be subject to threats at home. What happened in 1999 was that it was reported in a highly respected Vancouver newspaper that during the Persian Gulf War buildup, a body bag had been thrown on the lawn of a Canadian sailor's family home in Esquimalt, British Columbia, a short distance Victoria on Vancouver Island. The husband of the woman who reportedly found it was among those aboard HMCS Huron, preparing to take part in Canada's contribution to Operation Friction, the naval blockade of the Iraq War. Prior to the Iraq War, the intention was clearly to intimidate the soldier's terrified family and unnerve the sailor. He reportedly had been identified through a complete list of names published in local newspapers identifying those aboard the destroyer about to relieve others already serving in the Gulf. I have personal knowledge of this because I was a journalist at the Calgary Herald back then, and I remember being appalled one morning in the newsroom, January 21st, 1991 to be precise. I read what was in the Vancouver newspaper. I immediately got on the phone and called the police in Victoria and the military police and base commanders in Esquimalt to find out if that was, find out if that was true. I was told that they had no knowledge of the incident whatsoever. I did nothing with that, with what I learned, because I was not in the business of fixing other newspapers' mistakes. Miraculously, I somehow managed to file that away in my memory, however. 8 years later, I had begun my doctoral studies, and I was at home watching television news reports of a journalist friend of mine CTV's Joy Malbon in Aviano, Italy, interviewing a Canadian pilot operating an Allied force who had his back to the camera with Joy facing him. So his back was to the camera and Joy was looking at him, so you could see her face, but not his. That ran contrary to everything I know about journalism. I emailed Joy and asked her why she didn't put the pilot's face on camera. She emailed me back and explained that it was a result of a security issue. The pilots said restricted them from doing that, but did not explain why. I didn't know why either, but for some reason I tucked that email away in a filing cabinet that I labeled the Kosovo Air War. Something like 3 years later, I find myself at CFB Cold Lake interviewing pilots for my thesis research. I was very aware that there was next to nothing about the air war in the Canadian news media in 1999 because I had painstakingly read it all. I asked the pilots about it in the news media in Avio. I asked the pilots about it in the news media in Avio because I was aware that there had been, I was aware a number had been there, and I was told that they had learned lessons from the 1991 Gulf War. The lesson they learned was that body bags had been thrown on the lawns of pilots' families who had flown briefly during Operation Friction. Alarm bells immediately went off in my head because I was aware of the history of that story from 1991 about the sailor's family. After that, I pursued the Cold Lake body bag story exhaustively. Not only was a sailor's body bag wrong, but it had somehow morphed in the minds of Air Force commanders who believed it was about pilots' families who flew in 1991. It had assumed mythical proportions, which they then used as a rationale for self-protection or operational security reasons to forbid the airmen or those giving daily press conferences in Ottawa from providing anything but meaningless details and half-truths at best about their Kosovo operations. I actually commend General Jerkowski for his honesty relating to me that he had doubts about the body bag story, but acceded to subordinates' arguments that it was true. What is important, however, is that operational security argument manifested itself in Canada. General Jerkowski was the Canadian military's chief of staff, joint operations, largely responsible for the daily press conference briefings. The mythical operational security concern drove what the Canadian public was told through the news media, which was virtually nothing at all. How little was the public told is a good question. My research revealed that there were 386 newspaper articles and television reports printed, my research revealed that there were 386 newspaper articles and television reports printed and broadcast from March 24 to June 30th. Of them, 33% had just one sentence mentioning the CF-18s. They were there. Taken as an aggregate, 215 of them, or 55%, had just two sentences. They were there and they dropped bombs. The broader, more generous fighting, that 291 of those 396 stories, or 75.5% of them, devoted 6 sentences or less to the CF-18's contribution, is astonishing. I am standing before you today to tell you that not much can be learned about a war from 6 sentences or less. I relate this whole sordid censorship mess in detail in Scattering Chaff. But a very good question is, what are the strategic implications of these findings? Does the military need public support to prosecute a war? Or does it need just the Canadian public not to oppose it? I argue that Canadians were never in a position to support the Kosovo mission from what they knew. The only other possibility was what they had was not to oppose it. A good second question is, who decides whether the public should support or oppose it? Scattering Chaff argues that the Canadian government abdicated any responsibility for answering that question by denying Canada was even involved in a war. Let me reiterate that 500,000 pounds of bombs were dropped in terrifying battle conditions. You can read plenty in my research for Scattering Chaff. I'll end there. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you much for your privilege of your time and your patience in hearing me out. you, sir.
Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Valerie Percival to the podium. Valerie was the country director for the International Crisis Group during 2001 to 2003 in Kosovo and had a great role to play in understanding, helping people to understand the nature of the conflict and recovery. Valerie, please join me in welcoming Valerie.
Thank you very much. And thanks so much to Krenar and Laura for putting together this really thoughtful event. I was really moved last night and I was grateful for that opportunity. And I've been thinking a lot about the lessons from Kosovo and Canada's engagement in Kosovo for contemporary crisis. And I'm particularly grateful for this invitation because it allows me with some time to put some of these ideas onto paper. Policymakers often look to the most recent crises. These are the places from which they draw lessons. The foreign policy engagements that followed Kosovo were obviously in the wake of 9/11, and they included the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the engagement in Libya, the devastating war in Syria, and then what we're seeing now in Gaza and Lebanon. So I think Kosovo has kind of been lost in this. The important lessons from Kosovo have been obscured. So obviously the regional security environment in these other conflicts has been different and in some ways much more complex. Geopolitics of today is more challenging. We've got the rise of a resentful and grievance-filled Russia and a more disruptive China, as well as the reservoir of goodwill amongst the global South that characterized the end of the Cold War is pretty much gone. But Kosovo still has a lot to say that is valuable for our engagement in crisis and conflict-affected settings. And I wanted to share 4 key factors that I argue helped make Canadian engagement in Kosovo a success. And these are 4 things that Canada can employ elsewhere. And then my final slide, if I have time, I'd like to just reflect on some lessons from our mistakes in Kosovo that also should be taken into consideration. So I swear that I did these slides before Minister Axworthy's presentation last night about human security. So the first factor is that foreign policy needs a compass. So diplomacy, as many of the diplomats in the room know, is really largely a reactive exercise. As diplomats amongst us can testify, they're forced to daily respond to events that they can't predict. To ensure that diplomatic responses shape those events in ways that reflects Canadian strengths, national interests, as well as advances them, we really need this kind of clear foreign policy direction. At that time, Canada's foreign policy compass was calibrated to ensure that the protection of the well-being of civilian populations, and this was otherwise known as human security, was prioritized. This was really important and very effective for a number of reasons. First, it's evidence-based. So research that I did for a Lancet commission that was published last year shows that for the protection of civilians is much more than just a moral or an ethical imperative. It's actually a strategic one. We found that when countries are in conflict and do not protect civilian well-being, if they experience a decline in health outcomes, they're more likely to be trapped in conflict. And we also found that development assistance for health was a predictive factor in ensuring that countries didn't slip back into conflict. So we're in the process of doing more research to interrogate these findings, but I think that instead of seeing human security as something that Canada did for moral reasons, which was true, it's also a strategic foreign policy tool. Secondly, a foreign policy calibrated on human security is more universalist. It focused on civilian well-being, human rights, and dignity, and this enabled us to challenge the dynamics of conflict in Kosovo, which were quite difficult. So this enabled a justification for a military intervention without a UN Security Council resolution. It was also reflected in our policy towards detainees and towards prisons. And it was extended to the protection of civilians in Serbian and Roma areas from the reprisals that they were facing. So we were able to shift focus quite quickly and ensure the same Our foreign policy was focused on human security. We also were able to ensure that our engagement in Kosovo was part of a broader foreign policy strategy, and this really enhanced our legitimacy and credibility, both within Kosovo and outside of Kosovo. So we promoted the human security agenda in various forms around the world. We engaged in norm building at the UN Security Council, including protection of civilians, resolutions, children in armed conflict, women, peace, and security. There was obviously the landmark landmines convention, as well as responsibility to protect. We worked to create institutions such as the International Criminal Court. And we engaged in extensive diplomacy with human security. We created something known as the Human Security Network, which included diverse countries such as Mozambique. And lastly, on the human security foreign policy compass, it importantly empowered voices outside of the military or security sphere. My entry point for conflict is civilian and humanitarian. So I see conflict from the perspective of those communities on the ground that are affected by it. I've worked really closely with the military in many of my jobs, and I have the utmost respect for the professionalism, the dedication, and the sacrifice of the Canadian Armed Forces, as well as other NATO members. But it's important to note that security and defense experts have a particular perspective on conflict that's very different from the perspective that I would have when I'm looking at civilians in villages and their humanitarian needs. Both perspectives are important for moving the needle towards peace within a complex environment. And what the human security agenda did, was that it enabled these diverse perspectives to be present and active at the foreign policy decision-making table. Second factor that we can learn from Kosovo is we worked very hard to shape the implementation environment. As anyone that studies conflict knows, neighborhood matters. So it's a predictor of conflict in one place if you have a neighboring country in crisis. And so we employed active diplomacy coordinated across the region, including in neighboring states. Diplomatic assets were employed to Tirana and to Skopje. And we also used diplomats in places like Greece to ensure that they stayed on side and enabled the landing of military assets, which wasn't, how many more minutes? 5, excellent, which wasn't necessarily guaranteed. And we also undertook extensive engagement with Russia. So this included the dual mediation that Matti Ahtisaari and Viktor Chernomyrdin undertook to end the Kosovo War, and it included engagement in our post in Moscow. We also supported regional organizations such as the OSCE, playing this really critical and important role. To create that implementation environment. And we ensured that we provided a security guarantee. There was a deployment of sufficient troops at the beginning of the war, and we engaged in a very robust DDR exercise that included the really novel Kosovo Protection Corps initiative, which I can talk about. And finally, in terms of shaping the implementation environment, we used networked diplomacy. So we had really experienced diplomats on the ground, and because of that experience, they were trusted to take risks. And we coupled that with strategic civilian deployment within key organizations in Kosovo. And we have one of those individuals here, Minister Vanderbilt. And the Canadian government worked very well with this network of Canadians across these organizations, and it strengthened our response. Fourth, Kosovo was really a pivotal moment for the United Nations, and Canada really worked hard to make multilateralism more effective. So I was at a recent event last year in Ottawa, and it was, what can multilateralism do for Canada? I think that's the wrong question. Canada benefits when multilateral organizations function and are strong. And so it's in our interest to strengthen them. And we worked hard to do that in Kosovo. And while the U.S. was clearly the strongest military actor, in many ways the diplomatic actor within Kosovo. Having a multilateral mission dampened the sometimes negative influence of the United States, and I think enabled us to have more positive outcomes. And finally, we recognized that we needed to undertake institution building in partnership with the Kosovo people. So any discussion of governance models for contemporary conflicts, and I'm thinking of Gaza, won't work unless co-governance is built in from the beginning. So at the start of the Kosovo mission, there was a really rocky period where there was international actors working on the ground, and there were Kosovars who were competing with them in terms of administrative authority. And because of some really good diplomacy, and I think Wendy was probably responsible for some of that, we recognized that we needed to engage and work in partnership with Kosovars, and we quickly implemented the joint interim administrative structure, which was a pathway towards final status. So if you'll indulge me for just one more minute, in terms of our engagement in Kosovo, it was largely successful, but there were some failures, and I think that we need to reflect on those. So the first is, we obviously failed to prevent the war in Kosovo. Any war is a diplomatic failure in my books. And what would have happened if we had taken the Kosovo crisis more seriously earlier on? The second, we need to recognize the existence of informal institutions within Kosovo, so cultural institutions. And one of the things that we did is we worked to try and impose institutional models. So I know this from my work in the health sector in Kosovo. We were too quick to take Western models and think that we could just use a cookie cutter approach to make them fit in Kosovo. There's a wonderful book called The Light That Failed by Ivan Krestic that discusses how the failure to really respect local institutions in Eastern Europe was one of the reasons that populism has grown and liberal democracy might be eroding in that area. We failed to take organized crime seriously. I remember a call from a close friend in my early days in Kosovo, and her a close family member who had been a municipal administrator, a very progressive municipal administrator in Pristina, had been shot as a result of his efforts to crack down on organized crime. And we didn't take that seriously enough at the beginning. And I think it was challenging. I think that we didn't take economic growth seriously enough, and we didn't figure out ways to really build on the incredible entrepreneurship of the Kosovo people. And lastly, military force matters. We played an incredibly effective peacekeeping role in Kosovo, and I totally understand the reasons why we redeployed our assets to Bosnia. But there really was a decline in influence following the withdrawal of Canadian troops. And I think that was something that we should reflect on in future missions. So thank you very much. I look forward to any questions in our discussion.
Thank you for those candid reflections, Valerie. Next, I'd like to call to the podium Ambassador Wendy Gilmour, who is a dear friend. Actually, we met for the very first time about 2 days before the military technical agreement was signed between the Serbs, KFOR, and Kosovar officials. And Wendy was really in the thick of it from then on. So Wendy, please join me.
Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you also to Laura and Cranari for this event and for bringing us all together to reflect at this point on the Kosovo mission. It's a great opportunity for me as well, because I am, when I was in Kosovo in 2000, I was sort of about a third the way into my foreign service, a little bit less than a third of the way into my foreign service career. And I'm now at the end of it, which is a little bit scary. But it was just a tremendous opportunity for me to see an international engagement underway and to learn and frankly apply that to the next few decades of my career and Canada's subsequent interventions and the international community's efforts in trying to engage in situations in conflict and to protect civilians. And in some cases, apply what we learned in Kosovo, and in other cases, perhaps not, as Val has pointed out, not learn the lessons as well as, or apply the lessons as well as we might like. But it is a little bit scary to think that it's 25 years since the air campaign, since the implementation of UN Security Council 1244, which was a Chapter 7 mission, which launched the international community's intervention to restore the displaced populations to their homes in Kosovo, to try and create a secure environment in which a local administration could then work to determine the future of this region. And that ultimately led to the decision by the Kosovars in 2008 to unilaterally declare independence, and then subsequently from there to develop this new state. But it was interesting. I arrived in Kosovo in early summer 1999, as Mike had said, and with the specific mandate from Canada to join the NATO operation KFOR as what was then called the political advisor. It subsequently morphed to become a policy advisor, but basically a civilian advisor to the commander of the Kosovo force to provide the context on the broader political, societal, economic, those factors that were going to influence the conduct of military operations, which traditionally the military had not taken into account or didn't have to take into account in a warfighting mission or even in a classic, what was called interpositional third-party peacekeeping, simply separating two warring factions. What was happening in Kosovo and the first year of the operation subsequently is that the international community had taken on the administration of a particular territory. The UN was invested with the responsibility to govern Kosovo. The military, KFOR, under a NATO-led operation, was invested with the responsibility initially to secure the ground and ultimately found, because of the deployment timelines involved in civilian operations, to police the environment that was in Kosovo at the time. It was a fascinating time because the international community didn't have a rapid deployment timeline that was consistent with the expectations of the returning populations of Kosovar Albanians. And Mike, General Ward, spoke to that last night in terms of we were trying to deploy at the same time that literally what became hundreds of thousands of residents of Kosovo were returning. They were returning without an applicable law. Nobody knew what were the laws that were going to be implemented in Kosovo at the time. It wasn't the Serbian state's laws, which were no longer seen to be legitimate or valid, and there was as yet no local Kosovar laws. What happened is that the international community, the forces on the ground, were effectively applying their own applicable laws in their own area of operations. So the Canadians would be thinking, oh, what were the standards and laws that we had to apply when we were looking, the Canadian forces were looking at what were the crimes that were being committed, what were the difficulties being encountered. The Italians, the Dutch, the Germans were all applying their own applicable laws with respect of, was it appropriate to use force, deadly force, to protect patrimonial sites? Was it appropriate to use their assets to detain, and how those detentions were going to happen for what were everything from petty crime right up to violent murders and terrorism-related offenses. And that was literally being made up on the spot. And as Val has rightly argued, there was very little engagement at the time from local Kosovar ownership, because at the time there was no understanding of who were the legitimate people to speak on behalf of the Kosovar people that were returning, because all of the institutions prior to the air campaign, prior to the displacement, to the horrors that unfolded throughout 1999, were Serbian, and the Serbians were no longer considered to be legitimate. So these were the issues that were being grappled with in the early days of the intervention force, as the UN civilian agencies, which always have less resources and less ability to deploy quickly than the military do, were coming in slowly after the fact, even though they had the formal mandate to implement the law, to implement civilian policing, to implement routine local administration. And yes, what happened is local communities started up their own institutions that then became competing with, once the UN said, well, actually, no, that's not what we had in mind. We wanted a different type of local administration. We wanted to ensure that there was representation from residual minority populations in these local administrations, which very understandably were not considered to be legitimate by the returning Kosovar populations or those that had been forced to stay during this period, who felt themselves now empowered to institute a rule of law that was of their own making. So it was really a fascinating time. It was also an instructive time for the international community, because we realized, and I thought Bob's comments were very apropos, that our expectations of what we would need as an international force, as KFOR, as NATO, were very different than what was actually required on the ground. We didn't arrive in the early air campaign, or even subsequently with the international force, with the right tools, whether that was the policy, the rules of engagement. We had NATO countries arrive who did not have rules of engagement for non-lethal force, who weren't allowed to engage in crowd control or in areas of like civil protection, but were then forced to do so and forced to really make up some of these elements on the spot. We didn't arrive with enough bombs in the air campaign because we didn't have an expectation of how long it would last. And frankly, that's very instructive to what is happening in parallel right now over the course of the last 2 years in the expectations of what the international community needs to do to support Ukraine, and our inability to make necessary the resources to have the foresight to understand what was actually required if you're going to be prosecuting a conventional high-intensity campaign. And the people that suffer in these instances are the civilian populations on the ground. After Kosovo, I found myself working really for the next 7 years in Canadian peace operations. And not only Afghanistan, with very different context, our decision not to go to Iraq, but our desire to help the US once they were there understand what was required by way of civil administration and how we could help inject a level of human security into the US-led occupying force in Iraq, more or less successful, as we subsequently found out. We engaged in more peacekeeping operations, classic, but under Chapter 7 missions. The UN was actually willing at that point, because of what was perceived to be a successful operation in Kosovo, to understand that Chapter 7 peacekeeping operations was necessary in places like the Congo, which remains, as we know, to a very difficult place today. In Haiti, Chapter 7 operations were authorized, understanding local, I'm in my 5-minute warning, that local populations were under threat and that therefore international intervention was needed. What we have been unable to do, certainly in these subsequent cases, that Kosovo has been able to do, is help the local populations regain ownership and security over their own lands, and then chart a path forward to, frankly, a successful, prosperous, safer security for those communities. The Kosovo intervention really took place at the height of international ambition, our understanding that we had the ability as an international community, a well-meaning, human security, people-centric driven international community, to help a local population. And what came subsequently to 9/11 and through the engagements of the 2000s and onward to now is that, frankly, our level of ambition has dropped, that we are not able necessarily to apply those same initial efforts of international resources to try and resolve international conflicts in the same way. We heard last night from Minister Axworthy about the Canadian government's role in the establishment of responsibility to protect. What I take away from that is that, yes, Kosovo provided the example for the International Commission on State Sovereignty. I think I've got the acronym wrong, but it was something like that, that subsequently led to the 2005 adoption of the resolution on the responsibility to protect. But then changes not only in global interests and what had happened in 9/11, but Canadian political interests meant that we've now dropped a lot of the language of responsibility to protect, that we are not pursuing the leadership in this regard with the necessary hard resources behind it to implement cases of extreme difficulties with populations, including in really what seem to be forgotten conflicts at the moment, like Sudan, where the civilian population is being decimated as a result of conflicting parties, and yet the international community's attention has been diverted entirely elsewhere. But the NATO air campaign stopped what was an attack on a civilian population. It allowed for the space, not only for the return of the displaced populations, but for the establishment of new locally driven governance. It wasn't perfect. It took a while to get there, but ultimately we did have, we've seen in 2008, Kosovo's declaration of independence, and subsequently effort on the part, and we heard from His Excellency the Ambassador this morning, an effort to, and frankly, the demonstrated result in the growth of Kosovo's economic potential, its people potential. There remain challenges, however. There is a limit to the extent that military force can force the development of a particular, force the resolution of political conflicts. There remain difficulties in Kosovo with minority populations. There remain ongoing desecrations of patrimonial sites, despite the best efforts of the international community. A year ago right now, KFOR had to be re-augmented, moved back up to 4,500 troops, a fraction of the troops that were on the ground at the time, but because of attacks on civilian populations and ultimately attacks directly on KFOR peacekeepers themselves. So it's an ongoing story, but one which does provide really useful and frankly instructive lessons for the international community as we look at the world today. The legacy of Kosovo includes the recognition, as I said, that while military power can protect lives in the short term, sustainable peace requires long-term commitment. While it would be nice to think that Canada could be there for every country, every conflict, the sustained international commitment can be a multilateral one, it can be a multinational one. The EU has taken on the leadership of the international community's efforts in Kosovo. They are leading the ongoing political dialogue between Kosovo, its former parent neighbor Serbia, and elsewhere, but it's something which requires all of our attention to make sure that it is successful. So I'm really looking forward to the question. I would take away, though, from this particular gathering, it is crucial that we reflect on these engagements, and whether it's in 10 years or in 25 years, in this case, it's a valuable opportunity to do so. So thank you very much, and really look forward to the discussion today.
Just two pieces of housekeeping. If the speakers could speak right into the mic, because the program is being recorded and we won't catch your speeches if you're just speaking loudly. So lean into the mic. The second piece of housekeeping is that the washrooms are on down the stairs. I actually don't know, but I've been told they're downstairs. So in the basement, the washrooms are in the basement. So if you walk out of here, someone will direct you towards the basement. There are two people at the table. Speak into the mic. Thank you.
Thanks, Konara. I'd like to invite our next speaker to the podium, Dr. Gerry Van Kessel, who is the Director General for Operation Parasol, which happened in the midst of his Director Generalship from 1997 to 2001 at Citizenship and Immigration. Gerry?
Thank you, Mike. And my first comment is to commend Laura and Konara for how well these 2 days have been structured, and how well you're delivering on the content. I've attended numerous conferences over the years, and I've never attended a better organized and structured one. So congratulations. Second, the title of this, Memory, Politics, and Precedent. For me, the memory is, as a senior official in Citizenship and Immigration, to go back to look at things that you've done in your career, and things like this conference that in fact allows you to meet people that were affected by the policies that you proposed and by the operationalization of those policies. It says, as my son once said to me when he was 6 about something, "Papa, you done good." You know, so that's appreciated. The politics, we'll get into that when I discuss the priorities that faced us in this particular situations, and the precedent that in fact almost each movement of refugees has precedent, but it prevents something new that we didn't see before. And we saw that in the Kosovar movement, as I'll get to. Also, my comments about what happened once they arrived in Canada will be quite limited, for the simple reason that later panels will deal in much more detail and much better than I ever could. When I say that I was high level, I wasn't operational, that is correct, because I had some very good staff who were the operational experts. Let me start with the background in Serbia as we saw it, and as people who work with refugees, work with immigrants, how they thought about this situation. After the breakup of former Yugoslavia, there were 6 states. Serbia had a population of 9.5 million, and Kosovo was a province of Serbia. Kosovo's population was 1.8 million, but 400,000 of them were Serbs. And it's quite clear from the record that Belgrade favored the Serbs over the Kosovars, both constitutionally and in providing government jobs. The situation got so bad that there were massacres of Albanian Kosovars, and there was the Kosovar Liberation Army, so there was a reaction. And the Western powers had long been involved through its peacekeeping forces to try to manage in some kind of way the violence associated with the breakup of Tito's Yugoslavia. So, but the pressure that was put on Serbia to stop to alter its behavior really failed. And so we learned about military intervention being possible if the Serbs did not agree. And as this became more likely, those of us who were concerned about the movement of peoples, of refugees, got together. And on March the 23rd, 1999, Western countries, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the International Organization met in Bern, Switzerland, under the aegis of the Intergovernmental Consultations on Asylum, Migration, and Refugees. This is an organization that I was to head 2 years later. And we discussed the possibilities of what would happen if there was, in fact, military intervention. And so the first thing was, how many people were likely to flee? The kind of opinion that was expressed and agreed to was about 200,000, except one former colleague who said 800,000. And it shows you how difficult it is to guess what is really going to happen when conflict starts. And the kind of consensus was that 200,000 people would flee. Well, as luck would have it, the next day bombing started without UN approval. It ended June 10th, 1999, and Kosovo was placed under transitional UN administration and a NATO peacekeeping force. The predicted outflow, as I've indicated, far exceeded estimates. 860,000 Kosovar Albanians fled, 440,000 to Albania because of their ethnic cousins. There was no issue there of the kind we were to see with the 344,000 who went to Macedonia. Now, I'll emphasize that a little bit, shortly. 70,000 went to Montenegro. Another 400,000 were internally displaced. For those of you who are good at mental arithmetic, when you add those numbers up, it indicates that almost no Kosovar, Albanian, was not affected by what was going on. And it came to a head because the Macedonia's recently elected government was much more nationalist than its predecessors. And it was very concerned that the 344,000 Kosovars would upset its populace, its ethnic balance. And Macedonia is a small country, so it's 17% of the population. And so Macedonia periodically closed the border and demanded that NATO troops withdraw from its territory. And 30 to 40 Kosovars died died at the border because it was periodically closed. Macedonia blamed the international community for this problem. The suggested response for how to respond to this outflow for most people involved, including me, senior government officials and UNHCR, was to provide assistance to the countries of first asylum. But here's where I talk about what was new about this movement. The usual approach for UNHCR is when there's a situation like this, is to deal with people if they are internally displaced and help them on site where that's possible. The second priority was to provide assistance and protection in the country of first asylum. And the third priority, and it's a minor one, is that all else failing, and in small numbers, resettlement in a third country was the option. Canada, not being a country of first asylum, had in place well-developed resettlement programs. UNHCR accepted this approach, but it kind of didn't. And so halfway through our planning to bring people to Canada, UNHCR changed its opinion. And then we just continued planning because we figured we knew the way the wind was blowing and we had a job to do. So, and another example of the UNHCR's discomfort with this unique situation was that at a certain point, when the bombing halted, suddenly the Kosovars started returning from the countries of first asylum. UNHCR said, no, we need to do demining and so on. And we actually had one Kosovar in Canada who threatened to go on hunger strike if we wouldn't have let him go home. Well, the last thing we needed was attention paid to a hunger striker, so we basically ignored their objection. But it shows you how, when you may have priorities, but you have to adapt those priorities to reflect the situation that faces you. Okay. Canada's direction was decided on April 11th, 1999. This, for those of you who know the Christian calendar, know that this was Holy Saturday. I received a phone call early in the evening from my minister, Madame Lucienne Robillard, and she wanted to talk about what to do. She'd just come back from an exhausting trip to China, what to do. We agreed that providing assistance to the country of first asylum was the way to go. Well, she told me, she said, okay, I'm speaking to the Prime Minister and I'll get back to you after that's over. Well, 2 hours later, I had a phone call from her Chief of Staff who said, the Prime Minister has spoken to President Clinton and Canada has agreed to take 5,000. Other countries also agreed to share in this approach by taking 50,000. The next day, Easter Sunday, there was an interdepartmental meeting at Foreign Affairs, and my deputy minister said, Gerry, you're heading up immigration's response to this. I said, thank you very much. This movement was unique in several ways. First, this was the first time Canada became a country of first asylum because the resettlement issue hadn't come up yet. There wasn't time to determine that. And all the other countries were insistent that they were countries of first asylum here, and the Kosovars would have to go home when it was safe to do so. Okay. Because of the urgency of the situation, the normal way we handle resettlement or moving the people to Canada is to do all the processing abroad. So, and that includes background checks, medical checks, and so on. But here we didn't have time for that. So we shortcut that into doing a bare minimum on that side and moved the people to Canada. And you will hear later how that all took place. So Excellent. The last part will be handled by others later on. So in the end, we took 5,000 and some people, Canada, and another 2,700 came under the Family Reunification Program. It is normal in immigration that when there is this kind of situation abroad, we have a special program for close family members of those already in Canada. So, and ending my comments, I will let you know that the calculation I have is that 2,232 Kosovars went back to Kosovo, 4,800 remained. That decision was made, as were a lot of decisions here. I had a discussion with the minister, and I says, look, minister, we've got to decide whether they can stay permanently or go home, as other countries. Without a second's hesitation, she said, I'm not going to get into that. If they want to stay, they can stay. And that's, in fact, what happened. So finally, all I want to say is that our staff performed exceptionally. They were happy to do it. I actually visited one base where there were lots of the Kosovars, and the manager showed me around, and it was about 8 o'clock in the evening. When I dropped him off, he ran to his office because, really speaking, I had interrupted his work schedule. So they went very well. Our partners did very well. This could not have been done by immigration itself. D&D was important. Health Canada was important. Even the Food Inspection Agency was important. UNHCR, IOM, they all played a role. We know, we feel good about how the military handled it. But this good feeling in immigration is a passing phenomenon. About 2 months later, I was returning from some time off, and I heard on the radio that 4 Chinese boats had arrived on the coast of British Columbia, and that had been smuggled in. And in British Columbia particularly, the Director General of the region there became public enemy number 1. I'd like to reiterate what Minister Axworthy said last night, that it is important that the public believe that you are managing the program. The immigrants aren't managing you. So, and then a short time later, a failed asylum claimant, Ahmad Rassam, was arrested on his way by the Americans to bomb LA airport. So the goodwill was gone, and we were back into the old days where we did some good, but in the public mind, there was a lot of conflict. The costs, by the way, were 150 million, all borne by the federal government, which means that our dealings with the provinces were very easy, as they didn't have to pay and come up with the money. But as I look around on last night's presentation and looking at the posters up there, I think the decision to resettle was a good one to the benefit of both the people who stayed and the people who are already here. And the mutual benefit we've obtained is clear evidence that you don't always follow the priorities as they are written. Things evolve. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Gerry, and thank you all for very interesting and informative presentations. And I think it's given us a number of threads to pull on, both in the Q&A and in all likelihood in the panels that follow. We've got about 15 minutes for Q&A. I know that's going to cut into your first coffee break, but we're going to be full of coffee, believe me, before we get to noon, and it's not going to be an issue. What I would like to do is to open the floor to questions. We have some mics. Please identify yourselves.
Hi, Jack Cunningham. My question is about Dr. Percival's point about the importance of Kosovo for the UN. In the research I've done for my own forthcoming publication on the Kosovo War, in Lloyd Axworthy's papers, Bill Graham's papers, online documents from the U.S. Department of State and the Clinton Library, the UN's role was marginal. Even before Canada had decided the prospects of getting UN approval were limited. The Clinton administration had decided NATO was going to be where the action was. because they didn't want a Security Council resolution that would put Boris Yeltsin on the hot seat. The bombing campaign, obviously, without UN approval, discussion of the subsequent peacekeeping force. Secretary Albright was insistent that be through a NATO chain of command. All the UN did essentially was provide a resolution at the end that had been essentially drafted in the G7. So didn't Kosovo really indicate that the hopes some people had vested in the UN were just one of the utopian illusions of the euphoria surrounding the end of the Cold War?
Yeah, so thank you very much. And I can really understand how somebody from the outside would have that perspective. And I think when we look at the United Nations, what we need to realize is that the United Nations represents different facets. So from my perspective, the United Nations was absolutely essential in Pristina. So if you hadn't had, and I don't know whether you saw the UN kind of governance framework. So I first went into Kosovo in late 1999, and then I worked there from 2000 for about 6 months and came back 2001 to 2003. And you could really criticize the UN, and I did in my reports quite extensively. But I think without the UN there, you wouldn't have had kind of an impartial transitional authority. It also enabled, there was a secretary, a special representative, the Secretary General, which oversaw various branches. So the OSCE did institution building, UNHCR did humanitarian issues. The UN itself did civil administration, and the EU did reconstruction. So I think that the political decision at the beginning to go in, obviously the UN was set aside, right? The bombing campaign took place without a UN mandate. But I do believe that multilateralism does make Canada stronger. A stronger multilateralism is good for Canada. We know that multilateral institutions reduce the costs of cooperation, and having worked in multiple places around the world, as well as for the UN, and I'm a huge criticism of the UN, I still think the world is a better place with it than without it.
Wendy, please.
I will be very brief because I do want to hear other questions. But again, I 100% support what Val has said and don't agree with the premise of your question. From my perspective on the ground for the first year, it was absolutely understandable that the initial UNMIC role was relatively small compared to that of the military. And what little academic research I've done over the last 20 years, but perhaps looking forward more, I am a firm believer in you have to understand the bureaucracy and the logistics of an operation in order to understand what was actually going on the ground. As the UN grew in size and got its resources there, and would have been faster had the international community resourced it to be faster, but that wasn't the case, it took on its specific role that was outlined in 1244. And when 1244, the UN Security Council resolution that established UNMIC and the mandate for the Kosovo force was adopted in June of 1999, it explicitly created a role for the UN in the civil administration of this now independently administered territory. And it was crucial to KFOR, to NATO, that there was a comparable civilian partner on the ground to take on the civilian role. And I can say right from the very beginning, the KFOR commanders, understanding the UN didn't have resources, knew that the military role would have to be wider than strictly a hard security role, but at the same time made every effort to include them in decision-making. So every day at KFOR headquarters, I forget if it was 5 or 5:30, the UN SRSG and his senior leadership would come and sit with the military commanders. And I saw, it would be a directly inverse scale. As the time progressed through 1999, the military role became more consistent with the ultimate intent or the original intent. The UN role grew and the UN took on its role as civil administration. And ultimately, again, as Val had said, was instrumental in establishing a locally accepted and legitimate administration to take on the role of civil administration. It could not have been done without a civilian international presence.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Bergen. I'm Dr. Alia. I had the pleasure of working with the Canadian military and the diplomats in Kosovo during the war and just before the war. I would like to ask you, how much do you believe that your book that brought so much of a insight into the Canadian military state during and just before the war broke in Kosovo and consequently after that is going to be able to sensitize the opinion here, so we actually don't ever find ourselves that our military, our brave people who we are going to dispatch in the future find themselves with outdated computers, outdated communication systems, as it happened in 1999.
I wish I had a crystal ball to answer your question, but I don't. I just know that in the Libya bombing campaign in 2011, by that time that Canada got involved, it had modern computers, it had forward-looking infrared systems, it did have night vision goggles, it had everything that it didn't have in Kosovo in 1999. Moving forward to what happens in some future conflict, China, Russia,
Yeah.
that's where my crystal ball fails. Canada is in the process of acquiring F-35s. There's some talk of nuclear submarines in the Arctic. Where that leads, I don't know.
Thank you. Fair enough.
I wouldn't mind just weighing in on that point also, because I lived it through a 35-year career. And certainly we were steeped in that culture of feast or famine within the Defense Department and the Canadian Armed Forces in terms of replacing capabilities when they got old, when they began to burn out, or when they were insufficient. We have a long history in Canada of sending our troops off to battle well unprepared, well unequipped, and we've caused unnecessary casualties as a result. There needs to be an investment in readiness that allows you to maintain a certain baseline from which you can also surge, but not from which you're actually on the verge of failure. And I think Canadians need to be more aware of that. And I think your point, Dr. Bergen, about allowing the media in on the secrets sometimes is helpful to conveying that narrative, conveying that message to the public. And the public doesn't want to be kept in the dark, but they'll only digest in terms of the news they receive what they hear. And there's a greater story, I think, that needs to be told, and perhaps better support of our public institutions and non-governmental organizations like the Conference of Defense Associations. And I notice Colonel Tony Batista, former head of that organization, take it as their mandate to help Canadians understand better how we can do a better job as a country. And that's just the defense part of it. It's also in diplomacy. It's also in development. And none of us wants to go to our jobs on any given day and do half of what's required. I think we've got tremendous public servants, tremendous professionals and Canadians of all stripes who really want to make sure that they can be proud of what Canada is delivering on a day-to-day basis. As we've seen in this particular case in Kosovo, I think we brought our A game and we did something that was very useful. That's my soliloquy. Sorry. Another question?
Chris Reason. Dr. Van Kessel, a couple of questions. One perhaps easy, and the other one maybe a little bit longer. The first one is Operation Parasol. Who came up with the name? And what does it mean, Parasol, in the context of this movement? And the second question is, Operation Parasol saw the extensive use of Canada's military bases in Atlantic Canada and Ontario, and they have never been used since. What was the decision or the process of deciding to use military bases in Canada versus civil society? Thanks.
Okay. The name Parasol as a cover for the entire movement of Kosovars to Canada was done by my staff in the resettlement branch. And those of you know that Rick Herringer was responsible at the time for resettlement. So they're the ones who came up with it. And a parasol suggests to me anyway, I thought it was a curious choice at first too. But a parasol is something you put over your head to protect you from the elements. And I think in many ways, that was a pretty apt description of what we were doing here. We were protecting people from the elements over which they had no control. The second is the use of military bases. That was when the decision was made that the Department of National Defense would be intimately involved, and that we had to have a place where people could go, stay, be processed, and so on. You know, there's not a lot of places where you can put 5,000 people. The military has bases and has accommodation possible. Normally, when we bring people to Canada as resettled refugees, we do all the processing abroad. And when they come to Canada, they spend a day or two. They spend a day or two having the processing finalized and then go on to their sponsorship group or wherever they're going, or family members or whatever. But that's because everything has been done. Processing had to be finished, but processing as people about whom we had not yet made a final decision as to what would happen to them, whether they would return or whether they would be resettled. And of course, in the best Canadian edition, we decided on both. So that I think that's the reason, simply accommodation. And let me say that the military got a lot of plaudits last night, well-deserved, and from us too, very, very well-deserved, because they were total pros in everything that they did, that they provided. And what I liked so much about this one, there was no backbiting, there was no second guessing. We had a job to do for all the partners, and we did it. So,
Thank you. On that very positive note, I'd like to wrap up this panel and thank our panelists for giving us a very hot start, I think, to the day's proceedings.